Hello everyone, and welcome to our lecture on protozoal diseases. This is another relatively short lecture, but it's also one that most people learn a lot from because a lot of these diseases aren't really discussed anywhere else. So hopefully this will be one that you get a lot out of. Our first protozoa is one called Naegleria fowleri. This is an amoeba. If you think back to Unit 1, remember there are 4 basic classifications of protozoa: the amoeba, which are also called the pseudopodia, the apicomplexan, the ciliates, and then the flagellates. So this one is an amoeba. And in terms of where we find this one, what its lifestyle is like, we find it primarily in warm, shallow waters. The bad news for us is that this particular amoeba, when it gets into the human body by way of the nose, it actually starts to burrow into the brain, where it generally causes some kind of fatal infection. So with this one, this is an interesting one because we oftentimes will find it actually in the Southwest or in the southern part of the United States, anywhere there are warm, relatively still, shallow waters. We tend to find this amoeba. And oftentimes what will happen is people will go swimming in a certain area, usually kind of a natural body of water, something like a lake or a river or a stream. They will either dunk their head under the water or some of the water will splash onto their face. And this amoeba will start to literally crawl up their nose through the cribriform plate, which is kind of right here in your brain or near your brain, and then actually start to burrow in to kind of this frontal region of your brain right there. Most of the time, the symptoms are things like severe headaches, inflammation, body aches, fever, and typically once the symptoms start, it is too late to treat someone. However, there have been some success cases recently where they have induced a coma, which kind of allows the brain and the body to rest a little bit while they try to treat the infection with antiprotozoal drugs. It's not super effective, but it's better than nothing, basically, because if you don't do this, then the person's almost certainly going to die anyway. And if you do this, there's at least a chance. Now, like I said, most of the time, these types of infections occur because someone has been exposed to natural bodies of water. However, occasionally, there have been a few cases, not very many, but just a few, where someone was using something like well water to use a neti pot, and they didn't boil the water first. So they heated up the water but didn't boil it. They got it nice and warm. They put in their little salt solution or whatever it is they do for their neti pot. And then they used their neti pot, which unfortunately just basically injected the amoeba right into their nose, and they got an infection and died from it. So if you are a neti pot user, I would always advise boiling the water first, and then of course letting it cool to a suitable temperature. Don't put boiling water directly into your nose. That would also be a bad idea. But always a good idea to make sure that that water that you're using is sterile and will not contain any of this amoeba. Most of the time, if you're using city water, water that comes out of your tap that's not well water, you should be fine anyway. But there's not necessarily any harm in boiling that water one more time just in case. Our next protozoa is one called Giardia intestinalis, and you can see this little asterisk here. What I always like to remind people, or at least tell people about, is this is one of the first microbes that Van Leeuwenhoek noticed. Again, remember way back to Unit 1, Van Leeuwenhoek was the first person to get credit for observing microbes. To our knowledge, he was the first person to ever actually see microbes. And this was one of the first ones he saw. He actually took his own fecal matter, put it onto a slide, and checked it out with his little microscope, and he saw this. So Giardia intestinalis is a flagellate. In terms of its life cycle and distribution, it's found primarily associated with the mammalian GI tract, which does include humans. Humans are mammals. And the thing about this one is that once it exits the mammalian GI tract, typically in the process of being excreted with fecal matter, It can exist in the environment for a fairly long time because it makes some pretty sturdy cysts. Now remember, cysts are protective structures for protozoa. They're not nearly as protective as something like a bacterial endospore, but nevertheless, they are protective structures that certain protozoa can use to kind of hang out in the environment until a suitable host comes along. And Giardia happens to produce a very sturdy cyst that can last for a long time out in the environment. Then, when another mammal comes along and happens to ingest this cyst, the protozoa will go through the GI tract, where most of the time it kind of settles in the small intestine, sometimes the large intestine as well. And it uses these little sucker-like structures to kind of hang on to the intestine and just allow it to stay there, multiply, and cause more problems for us. So the symptoms of this typically include yellow, oftentimes foamy diarrhea. Oftentimes there's stomach cramping or intestinal cramping as well. Sometimes a low-grade fever. And for some people, this will be a relatively self-limiting infection, meaning they will clear it on their own. Their body will take care of it and they won't need treatment other than making sure they're getting enough fluids to withstand the diarrhea. But for other people, in fact, maybe even many people, they will need some kind of antiprotozoal medication, and probably the most common one that's given is metronidazole, which is also called Flagyl. So this little guy kind of looks at you and smiles at you, but will definitely cause some serious GI dysfunction if it gets into your intestines. Our third protozoa to talk about is one called Trichomonas vaginalis. It is also a flagellate, and it is found almost exclusively associated with the human urogenital tract. And 50% of the people who have this are asymptomatic, meaning they don't show any symptoms. This does not mean that 50% of people in any given population are carriers necessarily. It just means that of the people who are carrying it, half of them don't show any symptoms, which is especially problematic because it means it can be transmitted to someone else very easily that way. In terms of the infections that this one causes, it causes an infection that we call trichomoniasis, which typically leads to a green or yellowish discharge, pain in the urogenital area, and oftentimes inflammation, at least for the people who show symptoms. Remember, about half of the people who have this won't show any symptoms. Most of the time, if a woman or a female becomes infected with this, they are more likely to show symptoms. Males are a little bit less likely to show symptoms, but they can be symptomatic as well. In terms of transmission, it is transmitted almost exclusively sexually. This is another one that just doesn't really live outside of the human body very long. And fortunately, it is very treatable as long as someone knows that they are infected with it. If they are infected with it, most of the time they're given Flagyl, and any sexual partners that they have are also given Flagyl. It's important to treat everyone, even if they're not symptomatic, because again, many people will carry this with them and will be infected with it without showing any symptoms. In terms of prevention, using safe sex practices, things like condoms, are typically the best way to prevent it. Our second to last protozoa is one called Toxoplasma gondii. This is an apicomplexan protozoa, meaning that it doesn't have any locomotive structures of its own. It just relies on its host to move it around. In terms of the life cycle and distribution, it is found worldwide. So basically we find this on every continent wherever cats exist, basically. It is primarily associated with felines and the soils that felines are associated with. So it's carried most of the time in their GI tract. It's expelled from their body with fecal matter. And so any soils that cats, whether they are things like house cats or we're talking about things like lions and tigers, etc., bigger cats, they will also carry it. So any soils that cats are associated with tend to have this protozoa in them. This is another one that forms some pretty sturdy cysts. So it often just hangs out in the environment in its cyst form until a suitable host comes along. And then when a suitable host comes along, it tends to get into the body via the fecal oral route, get swallowed, makes it into the GI tract, and oftentimes will come out of its cyst form in the small intestine and kind of infect the small and large intestine and start to cause some problems there. This one's interesting because most of the time it doesn't cause typical GI symptoms. So you're not talking about cramping or diarrhea or things like that. You might get some of that. But oftentimes with this one, there's just kind of a general feeling of body aches, maybe a low-grade fever, just kind of generally feeling under the weather, not feeling great. And then for most people, it will go away on its own. By adulthood, 90% of people in any given population have had what we call toxoplasmosis. So when you get infected with this organism, it's called toxoplasmosis. Most of us have been exposed to this organism. Most of us have probably had this disease without even knowing it. Because again, for most people, it's a fairly mild, self-limiting illness, and the symptoms are not very distinct. They're not ones that you would look at and say, oh, that's toxoplasmosis. They're ones that you would look at and say, oh, maybe I had the flu, or maybe I just had a cold, or maybe, I don't know, I just didn't feel great for a week or so. That being said, there are some situations where this can be especially problematic. This is another organism that is one of the few that can cross the placenta into a developing fetus. So, like I said, there aren't very many that can do this. However, things like the bacteria that causes syphilis and this particular protozoa can do that. If a woman becomes infected with this protozoa for the first time in her life, and she happens to be pregnant at the same time, this protozoa will cross the placenta into the developing fetus and can lead to all kinds of problems. It can lead to things like cognitive delays, it can lead to stunted growth, it can lead to even things like cardiac problems in the fetus. So there's a lot of potential problems with getting infected with this for the first time if you or someone you know happens to be pregnant. This is why they tell pregnant women not to change the litter box of cats if at all possible. So if you have a cat as a pet and you happen to be pregnant or your partner happens to be pregnant, generally the pregnant person is advised not to change the litter box on the off chance that they maybe have not been infected with this organism before and have the ability to pass it on to the developing fetus. Now, another time this infection can be particularly problematic is if someone is HIV positive or they have AIDS. This is an organism that, like I said, most of the time for most people with a relatively functional immune system, this is not going to cause many problems. But for people who have HIV and or AIDS, if they are immunosuppressed, which they typically are, then this organism will oftentimes migrate outside of the GI tract and move into other organ systems, even into the brain, and cause some issues that way. In terms of treatment, this is one that we can treat fairly easily with sulfadiazine. Most of the time it's a very effective treatment. Again, a lot of people have had this, they don't even know they've had this, and they just kind of move on with their lives without treatment. But for various people who do end up needing treatment, fortunately, as long as it's caught soon enough, it is fairly treatable. And finally, our last protozoa is one called Plasmodium. We're actually going to be talking about the genus Plasmodium rather than individual species because there are individual species, but we're just going to look at this genus as a whole. Plasmodium is another apicomplexan protozoa. And in terms of the life cycle and distribution, this is one that is found almost exclusively in the tropical regions of the world. It is transmitted through the bite of certain types of mosquitoes, which is what you're looking at here. Basically, what happens is a person who is infected with this protozoa will get bitten by a mosquito. That mosquito will take some of the blood from the person. That mosquito will then go bite someone else. And some of the protozoa that was in person A will now end up in person B. What ends up happening from here typically is that once the mosquito releases the protozoa into that second person's blood, the protozoa goes into their blood, eventually makes it to the liver, where it matures a little bit, not completely, but it matures to a certain extent. It's released back into the blood. From there, it needs to actually infect red blood cells. It has to get inside red blood cells where it can finish maturing, start to reproduce, and then be released back into the blood where another mosquito can potentially pick it up and transmit it to someone else. This causes a disease that we call malaria. And malaria is one of the most significant diseases for humanity. So even though this is not something we typically worry about in the United States, it is something that affects millions of people worldwide every single year. It causes a lot of death, a lot of disease, a lot of heartbreak, and it is one that needs basically all of us to work together to try to eradicate. It also is something for us to be concerned about in the United States with climate change. The reason for that is that this organism was typically limited to the tropical regions because it needed to be spread by a certain type of mosquito. However, as the planet gets warmer and regions outside of the tropics continue to get warmer, as they get warmer, they increase in temperature, this mosquito has a bigger geographical range. Even just a 1 degree change in temperature is enough to give this mosquito much more of an area, geographic area, to be able to survive and potentially transmit this protozoa. So one, it is problematic for millions of people every day on our planet, even if it's not one that most of us in the US have to worry about. And two, this is something we have to think about in the coming decades, because as the climate changes and this mosquito has more and more of an area to be able to survive outside of what are typically considered the tropics, more people will potentially get malaria. So it's definitely something for us to pay attention to and be concerned with. In terms of treatment, if treatment is available to someone, then most of the time something called chloroquine phosphate is used. Not always, there are some alternate treatments as well, but this is kind of the standard treatment that is used for many cases of malaria. Kind of a little fun fact about this one is that the drink called gin and tonic was actually invented to help prevent malaria infections. As the English were starting to colonize certain regions of the world, they realized that if they drank tonic water, they tended not to get malaria. Tonic water has something called quinine in it, and quinine helps prevent malarial infections. And then I guess allegedly, this is just legend at this point, the gin was added to make the tonic water a little bit more palatable. So gin and tonics were a drink that was, again, allegedly, this is kind of legend at this point, invented to help prevent some people from developing malarial infections as they started to colonize the tropical regions of the world.